My name is Terry Brown. I'm with the Wisconsin Association of Railroad Passengers. On April 30th, 2020, the Federal Railroad Administration held a public hearing on rulemaking for passenger rail on-time performance standards. This meeting was tremendously crucial to the process revising or updating the rules and laws regarding on-time performance, not only for Amtrak passenger trains, but other passenger trains as well. Over the past few years, I personally have become accustomed to these hearings, particularly by the congressional committees and subcommittees, to have full video records of the proceedings in addition to printed transcripts. But due in large part to the concerns of COVID-19, this hearing was performed solely by telephone with no audio backup. For passenger rail advocates, the issues at stake here are critical. The rules and laws that will be set forth here in the second part of the year may likely have an impact on passenger rail performance for the entire decade before the next revisions. These issues being discussed with this committee right now may likely have an unintended consequence of aiding the way passenger rail begins to reestablish itself coming out of the COVID-19 lockdowns across the country. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, many people would rather listen to a monologue than read it on a printed page. For these reasons, I decided to pursue this project of reenacting the testimony from April 30th, using actors, if you will, volunteers to read the testimony given. They are captured on video and assembled in the hearing order. In advance, I would like to thank every person that devoted some time making this project happen. The actors or volunteers you will see on this video may or may not be involved with passenger rail advocacy. Some may simply be interested in riding a train to meet the travel demands of their job. Some only ride occasionally for pleasure. But all have come together to help you better understand what is going to be happening through the rest of this month. Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this telephonic public hearing on the Federal Railroad Administration's proposed rule setting forth metrics and minimum standards for intercity passenger rail service as required by Section 207 of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of 2008. My name is Michael LESTINGI, and I am the Director of the Office of Policy and Planning in FRA's Office of Railroad Policy and Development. I will be the hearing officer for today's proceeding. For the record, we are conducting this public hearing telephonically. In the hearing notice for this proceeding, FRA asked any person wishing to participate in the public hearing should, as a courtesy, notify FRA at least 5 working days prior to the date of the hearing and submit the oral statement they intend to make at the proceeding and to provide certain identifying information. We subsequently issued requests from representatives from the following entities: Jim Matthews from the Rail Passengers Association, Ian Jefferies from the Association of American Railroads, Ray Chambers from the Association of Independent Passenger Rail Operators, Michael Mattiucci from Canadian National, Randall Hunt from the Norfolk Southern Railway Company, Andy Daly from CSX Transportation, Chuck Hubbard from Canadian Pacific, and Robert Guy from the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. The purpose of today's hearing is to provide interested parties the opportunity to offer comments regarding the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, for the metrics and minimum standards for intercity passenger rail service. On March 31st, 2020, the FRA published the proposed rule. On April 13th, 2020, FRA published the announcement of this public hearing. The comment period for the NPRM is open through June 1, 2020. Written comments in response to views or information provided at this public hearing must be received by that date. We look forward to reviewing and considering all the comments as we develop the final rule for this program. At this time, the hearing officer would like to recognize Mr. Ian Jefferies.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Jefferies. I am President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads. On behalf of the freight railroad members of the AAR that host Amtrak trains, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. AAR wishes to emphasize that the freight railroads are partners with Amtrak across the country. Passenger railroads play a key role in enhancing mobility, reducing congestion, decreasing dependency on foreign oil, and reducing emissions. Today, freight railroads provide the foundation for much of our nation's passenger rail. Nearly all of Amtrak's more than 20,000-mile system outside the Northeast Corridor consists of tracks owned and maintained by freight railroads, with little of that cost being shared by Amtrak or its passengers. The rulemaking process began with the enactment of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of 2008. Section 207 of PREA requires FRA to jointly develop with Amtrak metrics and minimum standards to measure performance, including on-time performance of Amtrak's intercity passenger trail operations. Relatedly, Section 213 of PREA authorizes interested parties to initiate an investigation at the Surface Transportation Board if a train fails to meet the on-time performance minimum standard for 2 consecutive quarters. The opportunity to bring finality to this statutory mandate in the proper manner will create certainty for Amtrak, the host railroads, and most importantly, the traveling public. Unfortunately, the notice of proposed rulemaking in its current state falls short of achieving the desirable outcome. AAR's host railroad members appreciate that the proposal sets forth one metric to measure the on-time performance of Amtrak trains and a single minimum standard for customer OTP of 80% for any 2 calendar quarters. The single standard tracks with Section 213 of PREA, the statutory prerequisite for STB investigation. We agree that a simple, straightforward approach is important. However, the proposal fails to recognize and resolve a number of critical issues that our written comments, and more specifically, those of our host members, will address, including many current schedules are outdated and none were designed to achieve customer OTP. Delays beyond an individual host railroad's line segment on multi-carrier routes should not trigger the standard for STP investigation, and in order for host railroads to monitor their performance against the metric, identify improvement opportunities, and take corresponding corrective action, they need a close to real-time electronic feed of recent, current, and forecasted station-specific ridership data, as well as historical data for analyzing schedules. In my comments today, I want to focus on our single most significant and common concern, that to ensure the OTP metric and standard meets Congress's goal in PREA of identifying underperforming trains, the schedules against which the metric is measured must be revised and updated as necessary to ensure the standard is reasonably achievable. The host railroads will expand upon and explain their other concerns in their own testimony and with written comments. The use of proposed schedules to measure the OTP of a train makes sense. However, we have serious concerns with the proposed rule's failure to require the schedules to be redesigned to incorporate the new metric and address pre-existing schedule issues, because none of the schedules being used today were designed around the proposed customer OTP metric. Some have not been updated for a decade, as a matter of fact. The NPRM clearly stated Amtrak's published train schedules have not been designed with the customer OTP metric in mind. We agree, and we believe Amtrak must as well. Until the current schedules are fully updated and reflect the relevant metric, passengers will continue to suffer from unreliable, misleading schedules, and Amtrak's on-time performance will be measured against an unrealistic baseline. Instead of requiring the renegotiation of these schedules with the host railroads to incorporate the new metric and assure that they are reasonably achievable, whether through adding, removing, or reallocating scheduled time, the proposal merely recommends that Amtrak and host railroads discuss how to reallocate recovery time and schedules and suggest schedule principles to use in those discussions. That is troubling because FRA proposed a similar process in 2010 for all stations OTP, and I understand that many, if not most, schedules were nonetheless not updated to reallocate recovery time for the new metric or to address other long-standing schedule issues. In the currently proposed rule, FRA even recognizes that where a train's OTP is measured against the published train schedule, the train's schedule should be aligned with the particular OTP measure used to evaluate the train's performance. But the proposal does not take the next logical step to require such adjustment as it should. Even so, the rule explains that whether or not a train schedule is modified, the train's performance may be subject of an STB investigation. This means that STB investigations could be initiated regardless of the fact that the schedules were not designed with the customer OTP metric in mind. This is an irrational approach. It does nothing to help the customer who is the intended beneficiary. It will instead waste STB resources on unnecessary, unproductive investigations that should never have been initiated in the first place, because an updated schedule would have obviated the basis for such proceedings. Merely assuming that Amtrak would engage with most host railroads to discuss potential published train schedule adjustments to align the schedules with the proposed customer OTP metric, as the NPRM states, is not enough. You will hear from hosts directly about their experiences and concerns, but it is clear that scheduled negotiations are not easy. We would suggest Amtrak has little incentive under this proposal to negotiate a revised schedule, when Amtrak's host would otherwise be subject to an STB complaint based on the current schedule. We see the failure to require schedule modifications as a fundamental legal flaw in the proposal's approach and structure. FRA should not base its rule on flawed factual assumptions or one rooted in hopeful speculations that the parties will behave differently than they have in the past. In sum, even though there is recognition by FRA that the existing schedules were not designed for customer OTP and that the schedules should be adjusted for that purpose, the quote, NPRM does not require published train schedule modifications. What is certain is that without such a change to the proposed rule, the opportunity to properly measure on-time performance against a reasonable, achievable baseline will be lost. I want to reiterate that AAR's host railroad members respect an approach that provides a single OTP metric and standard. That approach, however, has to be fair, transparent, and reasonable. It certainly cannot and should not have the effect of subjecting carriers to unwarranted STB investigations. With respect to schedules in particular, we request that a process be afforded in the final rule to ensure the schedules are adjusted to conform to the OTP metric and minimum standard. This will ensure the goals of PREA are carried out and the metric and standard serve the interest of Amtrak, the host railroads, and the most important stakeholder of all, the traveling public. Thank you for your time and effort in this matter.
The hearing would like to observe Mr. Robert Guy.
Thank you. The Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, MEPIRG, is a compact among Midwestern states to promote, coordinate, and support passenger rail development in our region. MIPIRG strongly agrees that having accurate and fair standards for measuring passenger rail service performance and providing remedies when service is poor is critical to the health and vitality of intercity passenger rail. Ridership depends in large part on whether service is dependable. During fiscal year 2019, 9 state-supported and 8 long-distance Amtrak routes served the Midwest. Of those, only the Hiawatha service between Chicago and Milwaukee had an on-time record of over 80% during the fiscal year. Many routes had extremely poor on-time performance, or OTP. In fact, 3 Midwestern routes were at the very bottom of the nation's 28 state-supported routes OTP, with Illinois' Illini-Saluki routes ranking last at 26% OTP. None of Amtrak's long-distance routes nationwide had an OTP during fiscal year 2019 over 80%, and only 3 had OTP over 50%. Section 24308C of Title 49 United States Code gives intercity and commuter rail passenger transportation preference over freight transportation in using a rail line, junction, or crossing. The train dispatching practices of each host railroad have a significant effect on OTP. Many host railroads have too often ignored the law by refusing to give passenger rail the priority to which it is statutorily entitled, resulting in poor and declining OTP by Amtrak on most host railroads. According to Amtrak, during fiscal year 2019 alone, this caused 6.5 million customers on state-supported and long-distance trains to arrive at their destination late. A 2019 report by Amtrak's Office of Inspector General showed poor on-time performance waste taxpayers' dollars to the extent that a mere 5% improvement on all Amtrak routes could result in $12.1 million in cost savings to Amtrak in the first year alone. The proposed rule would promote better compliance with this law. Within this rule, we would particularly like to emphasize that using the customer on-time performance metric, wherein the arrival of every passenger on every train by route, including and especially those who detrain along a route, seems to be an accurate and fair way to measure OTP. We also concur that providing metrics to measure the degree of customer lateness on an individual host railroad are very important. Amtrak and state DOTs with Intercity Passenger Rail Service also need a clear, results-oriented way to address poor OTP that is caused by the host railroad. The ability for them to bring complaints before the Surface Transportation Board and requiring the Surface Transportation Board to initiate an investigation and make recommendations to improve the service, quality, and on-time performance of the train and to award damages and prescribe other relief is an important component of ensuring the complaints can be resolved and OTP approved. We also agree that train schedules should be realigned to distribute what is now recovery time added at the end of a train schedule to instead distribute that time along the train schedule, and that the recovery time redistribution should not be allowed to add time to the overall train schedule. Also, as required by Section 207 of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, or PRIA, strengthening other metrics and standards for passenger rail performance and service quality, including cost recovery, onboard services, stations, facilities, and equipment are very important. We want to especially highlight that developing metrics for measuring the transportation needs of our rural communities, typically not well served by other forms of intercity transportation, should be a clear component of this rule. We thank the FRA for providing this opportunity for public comment. We will provide specific comments on how the rule can be strengthened or clarified through a written statement submitted by June 1st. Thanks again.